Alright, what's up everybody? This is Vekktone here, and I'm going to be showing y'all a tutorial video on how to use a Linear PCM recorder as a input into another audio interface. So the benefit of this would actually allow you to use multiple XLR inputs into an interface which you normally wouldn't have the accessibility for. So for example, in this tutorial, I'm going to be using the Scarlett Solo, which is just a really popular interface and not too expensive, but only has one XLR input and another 1/4 inch input. So I can only record one mic at a time. If the mics are all XLR inputs, I would only be able to put one into those at a time. Some of the other Scarlett interfaces and the more popular ones, like the Scarlett 2i and on, basically have two inputs that are XLR and 1/4 inch compatible at the same time. But for my case, I can't do that. So I have a Linear PCM recorder which has two XLR inputs. So by hooking these up together and having them communicate and routing one sound through with the other, I can actually open up two more XLR inputs and record three people. So let's just get started into it. I just want to show you guys a few things on the interfaces before we get started. For the Scarlett Solo or whatever interface you're using, you might want to just look for these settings. So for the direct monitor, we're going to actually have that off because we don't really need that. We're only going to be using direct monitor, or in general, you really only use that if you're just checking and testing the volume of certain sounds, or you want to hear your voice for certain things. But we're going to be monitoring our voices inside FL Studio, so that's going to be all done in there, so we don't even need the direct monitor. For input 2 of the interface, since it's a 1/4 inch input, as you're able to see, it's really meant for like a guitar. But we're actually going to be using it for the Tascam. So the Tascam is actually going to be routed into it through that input number 2. So you can actually have the instrument and line switch flipped to instrument right now, because that's actually going to give it a nice boost for the sound. But depending on what interface you have, you may not actually need that. You may want to just have that on line. But for me, when I switch it to line, the volume is really low, and having it on instrument is best for me. But like I said, do what you think is best and what sounds best. Okay, for the Tascam DR-40, we're just going to look at a quick rundown as a side view of it. As you can see, there are three main things we're going to be controlling. The line out feature is where you normally plug in your headphones, but that's actually going to be where we're plugging in into our audio interface. So it's really a 3.5 millimeter input. So if you just have an aux cord lying around, then that's usually what you would put in there, or your headphone input would go into there. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to use on the other side, instead of it going into your headphones, that 3.5 millimeter is going to go into a 1/4 inch jack into your interface, into the input 2. So basically you can either have a 3.5 millimeter cord to 1/4 inch adapter. They're like little adapters. You can buy them on Amazon for around, I don't know, $7 to $10 for like a pack of them. You may have some lying around from your old headphones, but those allow you to use 3.5 millimeter like standard headphone cables into 1/4 inch inputs. Or you could even go on Amazon and buy yourself a 3.5 millimeter to 1/4 inch cable. So there is no adapters involved. Okay, so the next thing we're looking at is the extension in switch. It has three different parts to it. It has the line, mic, and mic plus phantom. So really for this tutorial, we're going to be using mic and mic plus phantom. For the phantom power, my PCM recorder actually has phantom power. Some of them do, some of them don't. You just got to make sure and know. That's for a condenser mic. So if you have a condenser mic and you need to power it, that's where you would do that. But for a standard mic like a Shure, like a SM57, like the really standard mic that a lot of people use, and you can see it online, it's about $100. You don't need phantom power for those types. I'm going to be using both right now for the tutorial so I can show you all different setups. So I'm going to be using the Shure SM57 and the AT2035, which is like the standard mic I usually do for my tutorial videos. And lastly, we have the input level, which is actually what controls the input volume of whatever mic you have plugged in or whatever source you're controlling. Because the Linear PCM recorder I have has built-in microphones, you can actually control the input of those microphones and both XLR inputs that you have. So you have to know how to actually select each microphone to control the input, and you have to know where those settings are, and it's different for every recorder. If you have specific questions, I may be able to help you with that. Just let me know. Okay, so within FL Studio, we can actually see where we would select our inputs. They would just be on their own independent channels. So in this example, I have the Scarlett input number 1 and the Scarlett input number 2. because the Scarlett is what's directly hooked up to FL Studio. The Tascam is just going into the Scarlett as an input. So we're using our regular old audio interface and the inputs that are associated with it. So when you actually go into your audio settings and select your audio interface, it should pick up those inputs as their own channels, and that's what I'm doing here. So I can see, if you see up in the right corner, the red circle is on input 1. That's my XLR input for the Scarlett Solo. So for input 2, I would be on my own separate channel, and that's for the Tascam. That's where the 2 XLR inputs on the Tascam are going to come through. So yeah, there's that. And before we get into it, I just want to have one word of caution for you guys, is that always make sure when you're changing the configuration of your microphones and your audio interfaces, you want to turn the inputs all the way down, or turn the what you're monitoring down all the way, because you don't want to damage your ears or your equipment, because sometimes when you're changing that stuff around and operating phantom power, it can cause loud ringing or loud, weird, just bad noises that's going to damage your, really everything. You know, it can damage your ears, it can damage your mics, and you don't want to have to replace those expensive things, or especially your ears, which you can't replace because they're the most important tool when it comes to music production, and without them, you can't have any fun and you can't make any music at all. So, well, you probably could still make music, but it'd be a lot harder. So, all right, let's get into it. Okay, this is the first setup we are going to be doing. I'm using the Shure SM57 hooked up into the Tascam as an XLR input, which is then routed into the Scarlett Solo as input number 2. And that is done using the line out feature of the Tascam. And I'm just using a 3.5 millimeter to 1/4 inch cable to actually put it inside the Scarlett Solo. One other thing to note is that I'm using the Scarlett Solo's switch on the second input. You can actually switch it to either line or instrument. And right now I actually have it as instrument because that seems to, I guess, like increase the gain and just the input volume in general is a lot louder. If I have it on line, it's a lot quieter. So this is the first setup, and that's just something to note. You can test whatever you want with that, and let me know. Okay, this is the second setup I'm going to be doing. I'm using the Shure SM57 routed directly into the Scarlett Solo through its first XLR input. So I'm only using one audio interface, and that means the sound is actually a lot clearer because I'm just using the Focusrite, and Focusrite is already a very good brand to buy, and they are distinguished for their clear, distinct sound. So I think that contributes to it. And the fact that we're not using 2 audio interfaces and routing multiple signals through an out into another audio interface. I think that causes degrading of the audio quality. I could be wrong on this, but that's just what I'm noticing, because the background noise on the previous recording was a lot louder, and there was a kind of a hissing noise, if you may have been able to hear that. But here I'm really only getting the background noise from the room. So this is this setup. Okay, this is now the test of the Shure SM57 plugged in directly to the Tascam. No Scarlett Solo involved. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to actually record it on my SD card in my Tascam, and then plug my Tascam into the computer and just import the file directly into FL Studio. And from there I can just do it whatever I want with it. I can, add effects to it. I can put it on its own free mixer channel and just mess with it in there. So it's just a separate way to get the piece of the recording and put it into FL Studio. So some people might want to do it like this for sound purposes, or if you're on the go and you don't have your computer with you, that's what this would be for. So there we go. Okay, so this is another setup I have. I'm just running the AT2035 by itself directly into the Tascam, which then goes into the Scarlett Solo through its input number 2. So once again, I'm using the line out feature, and I have a 3.5 millimeter cable, which is attached to a 3.5 millimeter to 1/4 inch adapter, and that goes into the Scarlett. Right here you can actually hear that the sound is pretty clear, and the background noise isn't too bad at all, so this is actually a pretty good setup. It's really only when I use a Shure mic or my specific Shure SM57 that hissing noise is really apparent. So if I can figure out why that is, I'll let you guys know, but otherwise this is a pretty good way to do it. Alright, so this is a standard setup I use for most of my recordings, and this is how I've always done it. I'm using the AT2035 routed into my Scarlett Solo, just using its regular old input number 1, the XLR input, and I'm using the Scarlett Phantom Power. So this is a pretty standard and a pretty simple way to do it. This is how I like to record most of my videos, and will probably continue to do it this way. But if I'm ever podcasting and need multiple microphones with a bunch of people, then I would use both audio interfaces together. But for the purposes of tutorial videos and other production things like that, just this setup is the ideal one. Okay, this is now a test of the AT2035 recording in mono mode in my Tascam only. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using Tascam Phantom Power. No Scarlett Solo is involved, and I'm just getting the audio file from my Tascam. As I plug it into my computer, I open up that actual storage place and drag and drop straight into FL Studio. And then it's just like a normal audio clip that I can do things with, and I can drag it into its own channel and do whatever I want with it. So that's what this sounds like. Okay, so in this example, I'm just showing you guys what it would look like if you were to plug both microphones that you had into the Tascam only without the Scarlett interface. I've already shown y'all what it looks like to do that individually, to plug just one microphone in, so I'm not really going to go over what it sounds like to do both at the same time. The only difference is that you would be recording in a multi-channel mode. So for me, it's 4-channel mode that you would record in, and that allows you to actually control the inputs individually of both of the microphones, and that would be the same situation as before, as you would record it as a WAV file that you would output from your Tascam and then just drag and drop into FL Studio. The one small thing is that you would actually probably need to mix your audio file beforehand, because the inputs for the Tascam are left and right panned. So the thing is that they're probably going to sound weird on your headphones. Like, they might sound panned once into the left and one into the right. But some linear PCM recorders have a feature that allows you to mix down the signal, which then makes the panning perfect and balances both of the inputs, so it sounds like a stereo signal coming in right through the middle of your headphones, and it's not all messed up. And that's really what you would want it to be on for any purpose, unless you're purposely trying to pan it. But for most cases, you wouldn't be. So as you can see in this diagram, I have it output as raw WAV file, and then you would just mix down to balance channels, and that actually gives you a new WAV file. So once you would mix it down, it would, you would choose the file you want to mix it down, and then it would give you a new file. Maybe it would have the next number up on the file, like it would say, file 1, and then you mix it down, it would give you a new file called file 2. And that was what you would use to import into FL Studio. So that's what this would look like. Alright, so here's the dual setup I have. I'm running both microphones, the AT2035, which I'm using right now to narrate this part, and I also have the Shure routed, and they're both into the Tascam, and the Tascam is then routed directly into the Scarlett as input 2. I'm using the Tascam's Phantom Power, and that's exactly how we have it done, and so it's all being routed into FL Studio as input number 2, which is what I showed you guys in one of the earlier slides. So the sound actually does feel a lot better, and it sounds cleaner to me. There's not as a lot of a hiss in the background when I have both the mics running, as opposed to when I had one mic running, there seemed to be a louder hiss noise. Here's what the Shure sounds like in the mic. I don't actually have a filter on the Shure, so it may sound a bit harsh, but if I were to have another filter, then that would work perfectly. But now you guys can see exactly how this sounds when I have them both into the audio interfaces together. So we're using all 4 of our instruments to work together here. Okay, so this wraps up the video. Now you guys have seen the different configurations that you can do, and I'm sure there's a lot more if you just mess around with it and experiment with the gear you have. You can always find a way to actually kind of rig things up and make some useful stuff. So let me guys know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.